Officer Marcus Daniels stood frozen at the elementary school gate, his hand hovering over the radio clipped to his vest. Every muscle in his body locked in a single moment of confusion that was rapidly turning into alarm. Thor, his German Shepherd partner of 4 years, had planted himself between Daniels and the chain-link fence, with a posture the handler had only seen a handful of times in their career together. And every one of those times had ended with someone's life hanging in the balance. The dog's ears were pinned forward, his body rigid, a low, continuous growl vibrating through his chest that wasn't aggressive but protective, almost desperate. Thor refused to move. He refused to leave. And the target of all that intense, unwavering focus was a small girl in a faded pink jacket who stood on the other side of the gate with her tiny hands still extended through the metal diamonds, her fingers barely brushing the fur on Thor's shoulder. Daniels had seen plenty of kids interact with his K9 over the years, but this wasn't a normal interaction anymore. This was something else. Something Thor had been trying to tell him for days. And Daniels, experienced as he was, respected as he was, had missed it. He'd dismissed it. He'd assumed his partner was just being friendly, bonding with a nervous child who needed comfort. But now, standing in the cool morning air with parents streaming past on the sidewalk and the first bell about to ring, Daniels felt the weight of his mistake settling into his gut like a stone. Thor didn't act like this for no reason. Thor didn't refuse commands, didn't ignore his handler's voice, didn't growl with that particular tone unless something was desperately, dangerously wrong. And the girl was staring up at Daniels with eyes that were too wide, too still, too carefully blank for a 7-year-old who should have been laughing or running toward the playground. She looked like she was waiting. Like she'd been waiting for weeks. Like she'd been hoping someone, anyone, would finally see what she'd been hiding. Daniels took a slow breath and crouched down, bringing himself to the child's eye level on the opposite side of the fence. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. Thor shifted slightly but didn't move away from the girl, and Daniels saw the way his partner's nose twitched, scenting the air around her with an intensity that told the handler everything he needed to know. Thor had detected something. Days ago, maybe even weeks ago, and Daniels was only now catching up. "Hey there," Daniels said softly, keeping his voice calm and steady even as his mind raced through 1,000 terrible possibilities. "You remember me, right, Officer Daniels? You've been petting Thor every morning for a while now." The girl nodded, just once, her gaze flicking down to the dog and then back to Daniels. Her hand was still resting on Thor's shoulder, fingers curled gently into his fur like she was holding on to the only solid thing. In a world that had stopped making sense, she didn't smile, she didn't speak, she just waited. "Thor really likes you," Daniels continued, watching her face for any flicker of emotion, any crack in that carefully controlled mask. "He doesn't usually get this protective. He's a working dog. You know, he's supposed to listen to me, but right now he doesn't want to leave you. And that tells me something important. That tells me maybe you need help." The girl's lips pressed together into a thin line. Her eyes filled with something that looked like terror and relief all tangled up together, and Daniel saw her small chest rise and fall with a breath that came too fast, too shallow. She glanced over her shoulder toward the street, toward the direction most of the kids had come from, and Daniels followed her gaze instinctively. Nothing looked out of place. Just a quiet residential neighborhood. Just another Tuesday morning in a peaceful town. But Thor was still growling, still standing guard, and the girl was still frozen in place like a rabbit that knew the predator was close. "Can you tell me your name?" Daniels asked gently, though he was already pulling his notepad from his pocket with one hand. already preparing to make the call that would bring social workers and backup and all the machinery of protection into motion. "I want to help you. Thor wants to help you. But I need you to talk to me, okay? I need you to tell me what's going on." The girl opened her mouth, closed it again, then looked down at Thor with an expression so full of trust and desperation that Daniels felt his throat tighten. She was carrying something. He could see it now, the way her pink backpack hung too heavy on her narrow shoulders, the way her free hand clutched the strap with white knuckles. She'd been carrying something to school every day, something Thor had been scenting, something that had triggered every protective instinct the dog possessed. "Emma?" she whispered finally, her voice barely audible over the sounds of children playing in the distance. "My name is Emma." "Okay, Emma," Daniels said, nodding slowly, keeping his body language open and unthreatening, even as his pulse hammered, and Thor's growl deepened into something more urgent. "I'm really glad you told me that. Now, can you tell me what's in your backpack? Can you show me what you've been carrying?" Emma's eyes filled with tears that didn't fall. Her hand tightened in Thor's fur. And when she finally spoke again, her words came out in a rush of fear and shame and exhausted hope that hit Daniels like a physical blow. "I can't go home," she said. "Please, I can't go home anymore." Daniels felt the world narrow to just the three of them. Himself, Thor, and this tiny girl whose voice carried the weight of something far heavier than any second grader should ever have to bear. His training kicked in automatically, the protocols for child welfare cases flooding his mind even as his heart clenched, with an anger he had to keep locked down, buried deep where Emma couldn't see it. She needed calm. She needed safety. She needed someone who wouldn't add more fear to whatever she was already carrying. "Okay," he said quietly, forcing his voice to stay level and gentle. "Okay, Emma, you don't have to go anywhere you don't want to go. But I need you to help me understand what's happening. Can you do that? Can you show me what's in your backpack?" Emma's fingers trembled where they gripped Thor's fur. The dog shifted closer to the fence, pressing his body against the metal as if he could somehow push through it to get to her, and Daniels saw the way his partner's eyes tracked every micro-movement the girl made. Thor was reading her the way he'd been trained to read suspects and threats. But this wasn't threat assessment. This was protection. This was a K9 who'd made a choice about who needed defending, and nothing in the world was going to make him abandon that post. The girl's free hand moved slowly to her shoulder, fingers finding the strap of her backpack with the kind of careful deliberation that spoke of pain, of bruises hidden under fabric, of movements practiced to avoid drawing attention. Daniels watched her slide the pack off with a wince she tried to hide, watched her lower it to the ground between her feet with a heaviness that made his stomach turn. Whatever was inside, it wasn't books, it wasn't lunch or pencils or the normal cargo of childhood. "I've been carrying it every day," Emma whispered, staring down at the pink fabric. "I didn't know what else to do. I thought maybe if I kept it with me, if I didn't leave it at home, then maybe." Her voice trailed off into silence, and Daniels didn't push. He waited, giving her the space to find her words while his mind raced through possibilities, each one darker than the last. Thor's growl had softened to a whine, low and worried, and the dog's tail gave a single uncertain wag as if he was trying to comfort her from his side of the barrier. "Then maybe what, Emma?" Daniels asked gently. "Then maybe someone would notice," she finished, her voice breaking on the last word. "Then maybe someone would see." Daniels felt something crack inside his chest. 3 weeks. She'd been standing at this fence every morning for 3 weeks, petting his dog, waiting for someone to see past the quiet exterior and the small smiles and the careful way she moved. And Thor had seen it. Thor had sensed it from the very first morning, had tried to tell him in the only way a dog could, by refusing to leave, by standing guard, by making himself a shield between this child and whatever darkness she was running from. "I see you now," Daniels said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "Thor sees you. We're not going to leave you, okay? But I need you to open the backpack. I need to see what you've been carrying. Can you do that for me?" Emma nodded, her hands shaking as she crouched down and reached for the zipper. The sound of it opening seemed impossibly loud in the morning air, drowning out the distant laughter of children and the rumble of traffic on the street behind them. Daniels leaned forward slightly, his angle limited by the fence but his focus absolute, and when Emma pulled the flap back to reveal what was inside, he had to lock his jaw to keep from reacting in a way that would scare her. Photographs. Polaroids and printed images, dozens of them, scattered among wadded tissues and a small stuffed animal that looked like it had been cried into more times than he could count. But it was what the photographs showed that made Daniel's blood run cold. Bruises, dark purple and yellow marks on small arms, on narrow shoulders, on a rib cage that showed too clearly through pale skin. Timestamps on some of them. Dates written in a child's careful handwriting on the backs of others. "I took them with my mom's old camera," Emma said, her voice distant and hollow. "The one she kept in the closet. I wanted proof. I wanted someone to believe me." Daniel's hand moved to his radio before he'd consciously made the decision. His fingers pressed the transmit button with a steadiness that belied the fury and sorrow churning in his gut, and when he spoke his voice carried the flat, controlled tone of an officer reporting a critical situation. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I need Child Protective Services and a supervisor to my location immediately. Elementary School, Eastgate. I have a juvenile in need of emergency intervention, possible abuse situation, requesting backup, and a crisis counselor." The radio crackled with acknowledgement, voices confirming response times and units being redirected, but Daniels barely heard them. He was focused on Emma, on the way she'd closed her eyes when he'd said the word abuse out loud, on the way her shoulders had dropped as if a weight she'd been carrying for months had finally been set down. Thor had gone still and quiet, his ears forward, his body pressed as close to the fence as physics would allow. "You're safe now," Daniels told her, meaning it with everything he had. "You did the right thing. You were so brave, Emma. And we're going to make sure you never have to go back to any place that hurts you. I promise." Emma opened her eyes and looked at him with an expression that was equal parts terror and desperate, fragile hope. Her hand found Thor's fur again, and the dog leaned into her touch with a gentleness Daniels had seen him show only to the most vulnerable. "Thor knew," she whispered. "He knew something was wrong." "Yeah," Daniel said softly, his throat tight. "He did, and he wasn't going to let you face it alone." The world moved in fragments after that. Daniel stayed at the gate with Emma, his body positioned between her and the street, while Thor maintained his vigil on the opposite side of the fence, with the kind of unwavering focus that turned curious parents into concerned observers who gave them space. The dog's presence created a bubble of protection that was visible even to civilians, a clear signal that something serious was unfolding, that this wasn't a casual conversation or a friendly school visit. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, though Daniel's watch told him it had only been 8 minutes since his radio call, when the first backup unit rolled up to the curb. Officer Sarah Chin emerged from the patrol car with her hand already on her radio, her expression shifting from routine response to immediate concern the moment she took in the scene. Emma with her backpack open on the ground. Thor pressed against the fence like a guardian statue. Daniels crouched low with his notepad out, and his face carrying the kind of controlled tension that every cop recognized as barely contained fury at something they couldn't punch or arrest or fix with force. Chen approached slowly, giving Emma time to register her presence, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same careful gentleness Daniels had been using. "Hey there, sweetheart. I'm Officer Chen. I'm here to help too, okay? You're doing great." Emma's only response was a small nod, her hand still buried in Thor's fur, and Daniel saw Chen's gaze drop to the photographs scattered across the top of the backpack's contents. He watched her jaw tighten, watched her eyes harden for just a fraction of a second before she schooled her expression back into something soft and safe. She'd seen enough. They both had. And now the machinery of intervention was grinding into motion with the terrible inevitability of a system that moved too slowly for the children caught in its gears. But at least it was moving. The supervisor arrived next, Lieutenant Brewer, a 20-year veteran with silver in his hair and the kind of steady presence that made crisis scenes feel less like chaos. He took one look at the situation, listened to Daniel's abbreviated report delivered in low tones away from Emma's hearing, and immediately got on his phone to expedite the child services response. Daniels heard fragments of the conversation, words like emergency removal and immediate placement and detective unit, and felt a grim satisfaction that Emma's nightmare was about to end, even as he knew the harder work of healing was only just beginning. Thor hadn't moved. The dog remained locked in position at the fence, his body language screaming protection to anyone trained to read it, and Daniels felt a surge of pride and gratitude for his partner that was almost overwhelming. 4 years they'd worked together. 4 years of drug busts and suspect apprehensions and crowd control and routine patrols. But this was what Thor had been born to do. Not the arrests or the searches. This, protecting someone who couldn't protect themselves. Standing between a child and harm with nothing but instinct and loyalty and a refusal to look away. The crisis counselor arrived in an unmarked sedan 12 minutes after the initial call. A woman named Dr. Patricia Moss, who'd worked more child trauma cases than Daniels wanted to think about. She had kind eyes and a calm voice, and the kind of practiced warmth that put frightened kids at ease without feeling false or manipulative. She approached the gate slowly, introduced herself to Emma with the same gentle respect Daniels and Chen had been using, and within moments she was crouched beside the girl on the inside of the fence. Someone Emma's size, someone non-threatening, someone whose entire focus was on making this child feel heard and believed and safe. Daniels watched Dr. Moss examine the photographs with Emma's whispered permission, watched her nod and murmur soft affirmations, watched her carefully repack the backpack as if it were made of glass and explosives rather than pink fabric and broken trust. "Emma," Dr. Moss said gently, her hand resting lightly on the girl's shoulder. "I need to ask you something important, and I need you to be honest with me, okay? Are you safe to go home right now? Is there someone at your house who might hurt you if we take you there?" Emma's face went white. Her breathing quickened, shallow and panicked, and Thor responded instantly with a soft whine and a shift of his body that pressed him harder against the fence. The dog's nose pushed through one of the chain-link diamonds, reaching for the girl, and Emma turned to press her face against his muzzle with a desperation that made Daniel's chest ache. "My stepdad," she whispered into Thor's fur. He said if I ever told anyone he'd make sure my mom got hurt too. He said no one would believe me. He said I was lying. He said—" "You're not lying," Dr. Moss interrupted firmly, her voice carrying an edge of steel beneath the gentleness. "You're not lying, Emma, and we believe you. Every single person here believes you. And we're not going to let anyone hurt you or your mom, that's a promise." Daniels exchanged a glance with Lieutenant Brewer, and the supervisor was already moving, already barking orders into his radio for a second unit to be dispatched to Emma's home address with instructions to make contact with the mother and assess the situation. The stepfather's name went out over the air as a person of interest in a child abuse investigation, and Daniels knew that within the hour there would be detectives and social workers, and probably a dozen other people converging on that house to tear apart whatever lie the man had been living behind. Emma would never have to go back there. Not today. Not ever. The photographs she'd collected, the evidence she'd carried in her backpack like a burden too heavy for any child, would be enough to start building a case that would keep her safe and put her abuser exactly where he belonged, "We need to take you somewhere safe right now," Dr. Moss was saying, her tone still gentle but carrying the weight of immediate action. "Just for today, just until we can figure out the best place for you to stay. But Officer Daniels and Thor are going to come with us, okay? They're going to make sure nothing bad happens. You trust Thor, right?" Emma nodded, her face still pressed against the dog's muzzle, and Daniels saw her fingers tighten in the fur around Thor's neck. "Then that's what we're going to do," Daniels said, rising to his feet and moving to the gate's entrance where he could finally cross to Emma's side of the fence. Thor was on his feet instantly, his entire body vibrating with the need to stay close, and the moment Daniels opened the gate, the dog pushed through with single-minded determination that ignored every protocol and every command structure they'd ever trained. Thor went straight to Emma and planted himself beside her with his shoulder pressed against her hip, and Daniels saw the way the girl's hand immediately found the thick ruff of fur at his neck, like it was the only anchor keeping her from drifting away entirely. "We're going to walk to Dr. Moss's car together," Daniels continued, keeping his voice steady and calm even as his mind raced through logistics and threats and the dozen ways this could still go wrong. "Thor is going to stay right next to you the whole time, and once we get you settled, we're going to make sure your mom is safe too. Everything's going to be okay now." Emma looked up at him with eyes that wanted desperately to believe but had been taught too many times not to trust promises from adults. She clutched her backpack against her chest with both arms, the weight of it seeming less now that its contents had been witnessed and validated, and she took a tentative step toward Dr. Moss's waiting sedan. Thor moved with her in perfect synchronization, his body pressed close enough that she could lean on him if she needed to, and Daniels followed 3 paces behind with Officer Chen flanking on the opposite side. They formed a protective corridor around the child, a human and K9 shield that made it clear to any observer that this girl was under official protection and that anyone who tried to interfere would have to go through all of them first. The walk across the schoolyard felt like it took hours, even though it was barely 50 feet. Parents and teachers had noticed the cluster of police vehicles by now, noticed the uniformed officers and the unmarked car, and the palpable tension hanging in the morning air, and a small crowd had begun to form near the main entrance with whispered questions and concerned looks. Lieutenant Brewer intercepted them smoothly, his voice carrying authority as he asked everyone to please give them space and assured them there was no danger to the school or the other children. Daniels heard the words wellness check and precautionary measures float across the distance, the kind of carefully vague language supervisors used when the real story was too raw and too urgent to share with civilians who didn't need the details. Emma needed privacy. She needed dignity. She needed to not be turned into a spectacle for concerned strangers who meant well but couldn't help. Dr. Moss opened the back door of her sedan and crouched beside it, her hand gesturing to the seat with a warmth that invited rather than commanded. "Right in here, sweetheart. It's nice and comfortable, and I think Thor would like to come with us if that's okay with Officer Daniels." Daniels met Dr. Moss's eyes over Emma's head and saw the unspoken question there. This wasn't protocol. K9 units didn't ride in civilian vehicles during child welfare transports. Thor was supposed to stay with his handler, return to patrol duties, continue the shift according to the schedule and the rules. But none of that mattered right now. Not when Emma's fingers were still buried in Thor's fur. Not when the dog's presence was the only thing keeping the girl calm enough to move forward instead of shutting down completely. "Thor goes where Emma needs him to go," Daniels said firmly, making the decision in his gut before his brain could overthink the paperwork and the explanations he'd have to file later. "He's not leaving her side until she's safe and settled. That's non-negotiable." Dr. Moss nodded with visible relief and turned her attention back to Emma. "Okay then. You and Thor are going to ride together. Officer Daniels is going to follow us in his patrol car, so Thor's partner doesn't have to worry about him. and we're going to take you to a place where there are people whose only job is to keep kids safe. Does that sound okay?" Emma climbed into the back seat with movements that were slow and careful, like someone who'd learned to be conscious of every bruise and every sore spot hidden under clothing. Thor jumped in after her without hesitation, his bulk taking up most of the available space as he positioned himself between Emma and the opposite door, with the kind of deliberate placement that Daniels recognized as tactical protection. The dog wasn't just comforting her, he was making sure nothing and no one could reach her from that side, making sure she had a barrier between herself and any threat that might materialize. Dr. Moss closed the door gently and moved around to the driver's side, while Daniels jogged back to his patrol unit parked at the curb. Officer Chen caught his arm as he passed, her expression tight with controlled anger. "I'll follow the second unit to the house," she said quietly. "I want eyes on that stepfather when they make contact. I want to see his face when we tell him what Emma did." "Document everything," Daniels told her, his voice low and hard. "Every reaction, every word. I want this case airtight." "It will be," Chen promised, and there was steel in her tone that matched the fury Daniels felt burning in his own chest. That little girl carried evidence in a backpack for weeks because she thought no one would believe her otherwise. We're going to make damn sure she never regrets trusting us. Daniels nodded once and climbed into his unit, his hands gripping the steering wheel with enough force to make his knuckles white. The radio was already alive with updates. The second unit was 3 minutes from Emma's address. Detectives were being pulled from other cases to prioritize this investigation, and Child Services had confirmed emergency foster placement availability within the hour. The system was moving, slowly, bureaucratically, with all the grinding inefficiency of government machinery, but it was moving in the right direction. Emma would be safe. Her mother would be interviewed and assessed and given the resources and protection she needed to escape whatever web of control and fear the stepfather had woven. And the man himself would face consequences that Daniels very much hoped included serious prison time. He pulled out behind Dr. Moss's sedan and watched through his windshield as Emma's small silhouette leaned against Thor's larger form in the back seat. The dog's head was visible over the seat back, his ears forward and alert, still on duty even in the unfamiliar environment, still protecting, still refusing to stand down until his chosen charge was truly, completely safe. Daniels felt his throat tighten with an emotion that was part pride, part gratitude, and part bone-deep respect for an animal whose instincts had seen what human eyes had missed. Thor had known. From that very first morning 3 weeks ago when Emma had reached through the fence with tentative fingers, Thor had sensed the fear and pain and desperation radiating from her like a scent only a dog could detect. And he'd made it his mission to stay, to guard, to be the steady presence that Emma could count on when everything else in her world had become dangerous and unpredictable. The drive to the County Child Services building took 15 minutes through morning traffic that seemed determined to slow them down at every light. Daniels kept the sedan in sight the entire time, his eyes flicking between the road ahead and the rearview mirror where he could see Lieutenant Brewer's unit following 3 cars back as additional support. The radio provided a steady stream of updates that painted a picture Daniels had seen too many times in his career. Officers making contact with Emma's mother at the home, the woman's initial confusion giving way to shock and then tears as the situation was explained. The stepfather's absence from the residence creating both relief and complication as units began searching for him based on the vehicle description and workplace information the mother provided. He'd left for work early that morning. He had no idea the walls were closing in, and Daniels took grim satisfaction in imagining the man's face when detectives showed up at his job with questions he couldn't dodge and evidence he couldn't explain away. The Child Services building was a low brick structure with reinforced glass doors and security cameras at every entrance, designed to be both welcoming and fortress-like in equal measure. Dr. Moss pulled into the visitor lot, and Daniels parked beside her, already out of his unit before her engine had fully shut off. He moved to her back door and opened it carefully, giving Emma and Thor space to exit on their own terms, rather than reaching in to hurry them. Emma emerged slowly, her backpack clutched against her chest, and Thor jumped down beside her with his body immediately pressing against her side in that same protective stance he'd maintained since the schoolyard. The girl looked up at the building with an expression that was equal parts exhaustion and lingering fear, and Daniels crouched down to her level one more time. "This is where you're going to stay for today," he said gently. "The people inside are good people, Emma. They're going to take care of you. They're going to get you checked out by a doctor to make sure you're okay, and they're going to ask you some questions about what's been happening at home. And Thor and I are going to stay right here until you're settled and feeling safe. We're not going anywhere." Emma's eyes filled with tears that finally spilled over, tracking down her cheeks in silent streams that made Daniels' chest ache. She looked at Thor, then back at Daniels, and when she spoke, her voice was so small he had to lean closer to hear her. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing me." Daniels felt his composure crack just enough to let the emotion show in his eyes, and he reached out to rest one hand gently on Emma's shoulder without pulling her in or crowding her space. "You made yourself visible," he said quietly. "That took more courage than most adults will ever have to show, and Thor made sure we couldn't look away. You two make a pretty good team." Emma's hand found Thor's fur one more time, her fingers curling into the thick coat with a familiarity that came from weeks of morning rituals and desperate hope. The dog leaned into her touch with a gentleness that seemed impossible for an animal trained to take down suspects and search buildings for hidden threats. And Daniels watched his partner's tail give a slow, deliberate wag that meant more than any words could. Thor understood. Not in the way humans understood, with language and logic and legal definitions, but in the way that mattered most. He understood that this small person had been hurting, that she'd needed protection, and that he'd been the one to stand between her and the darkness until someone with a badge and authority could finish the job. Dr. Moss stepped forward with a clipboard and a soft smile, her presence radiating the kind of professional warmth that came from years of navigating trauma with children who'd learned not to trust easily. "Come on, sweetheart," she said, extending her hand toward Emma without reaching for her. "Let's get you inside where it's warm. And I think Thor deserves a treat for being such a good protector, don't you?" Emma nodded and took Dr. Moss's hand with visible effort, her eyes darting back to Daniels and Thor every few steps, as if she needed constant confirmation that they were still there, still keeping their promise not to disappear. The three of them walked toward the building's entrance, with Thor maintaining his position at Emma's side, and Daniels followed close enough to provide reassurance but far enough back to give Dr. Moss space to work. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a lobby that tried hard to look friendly, with colorful murals on the walls and toys scattered across low tables, but couldn't quite hide the institutional reality of what this place was. A way station for broken childhoods. A processing center for nightmares that had finally been dragged into daylight. The intake coordinator was a woman named Linda, who'd clearly been briefed ahead of time because she didn't ask questions or demand forms, or do any of the usual bureaucratic delays that made emergency placements feel like punishment for the kids who needed help. She just smiled at Emma, acknowledged Thor with a respectful nod, and gestured toward a hallway that led deeper into the building. "We have a nice quiet room set up for you," she said gently, "and a doctor who's very kind and very good at making sure brave girls like you get the care they deserve. Officer Daniels and his partner can wait right outside the door. They're not going anywhere." Emma looked up at Daniels with eyes that still carried too much fear for someone so young, and he knelt down one more time to meet her at eye level. Thor pressed closer, his body warm and solid against Emma's hip, and Daniels saw the way the girl's breathing steadied just from having the dog nearby. "We're going to be right there," Daniels said, pointing toward the hallway Linda had indicated. "Thor is going to sit outside that door like he's guarding the most important person in the world, because right now, you are." And when you're done with the doctor and the questions and all the hard stuff you have to do today, we'll still be here. That's a promise." Emma swallowed hard and nodded, then did something Daniels hadn't expected. She threw her arms around Thor's neck and buried her face in his fur with a desperation that made every adult in the lobby look away to give her privacy in her grief and relief and exhaustion. The dog stood perfectly still, his head turning slightly to rest his muzzle against her shoulder, and Daniels saw his partner's eyes close in what looked almost like contentment. This was what Thor had been waiting for. Not the arrest or the intervention or the bureaucratic machinery grinding into motion. This. The moment when the person he'd chosen to protect finally felt safe enough to let go. When Emma finally released her grip and stepped back, her face was wet with tears, but her expression had shifted into something that looked almost like peace. She took Dr. Moss's hand again and walked toward the hallway with Linda leading the way, and Thor watched her go with his ears forward and his body tense like he was fighting every instinct that told him to follow. Daniels rested one hand on his partner's head and felt the dog's muscles quivering with restraint. "Easy," he murmured. "She's safe now. We did our job." But Thor didn't relax until Emma disappeared through the door at the end of the hall, and Daniels moved them both to a bench positioned against the wall, with a clear sightline to that same door. The dog sat at attention, his gaze locked on the hallway, and Daniels settled beside him with his radio turned low and his mind already running through the case details that would need documentation and follow-up. Hours passed in that quiet lobby. Other officers came and went, delivering reports and picking up case files and nodding respectfully at Daniels and Thor as they maintained their vigil. Lieutenant Brewer appeared at one point with coffee and a brief update. The stepfather had been located and taken into custody. Emma's mother was cooperating fully with investigators and had already filed for emergency separation. And the photographs Emma had collected were being processed as evidence in what would likely become a significant criminal case. Everything was moving forward. Everything was going to be okay. The sun was low in the sky when the hallway door finally opened, and Emma emerged with Dr. Moss at her side. She looked exhausted but steady, her backpack replaced with a small overnight bag someone had provided, and when she saw Daniels and Thor still sitting on the bench exactly where they'd promised to be, her entire face lit up with a smile that was fragile but genuine. She ran the last few steps and dropped to her knees beside Thor, throwing her arms around him again, with less desperation this time but no less gratitude. The dog's tail wagged in slow, sweeping arcs, and Daniels watched his partner lean into the embrace with a kind of gentle certainty that came from knowing his work was done and done right. "Thank you," Emma whispered again, her voice muffled against Thor's shoulder. "Thank you for not leaving." "We told you we wouldn't," Daniels said quietly. And Thor never breaks a promise. 3 weeks later, on a cool morning that felt like a mirror of that first crisis day, Daniels and Thor returned to the elementary school for a visit that had been carefully arranged through Dr. Moss and the foster family Emma had been placed with. The girl was waiting at the same gate where everything had started, but this time her smile was real, and her posture was open, and she ran toward them the moment she spotted Thor's familiar form approaching across the parking lot. The dog's tail started wagging before Emma even reached the fence, and when Daniels opened the gate to let them through, Thor pushed forward to greet her with the kind of joyful enthusiasm he usually reserved for successful searches and quiet moments with his handler. Emma dropped to her knees and wrapped both arms around Thor's neck, and this time there were no tears, no fear, just pure relief and happiness radiating from both girl and dog. Her foster mother stood a few feet back, watching with a smile that told Daniels everything he needed to know about how Emma was settling into her new life. Safe, healing, beginning to trust again in small, careful increments. "He's doing okay?" Emma asked, looking up at Daniels with eyes that still carried shadows but also held something new. Hope. Belief that the world contained good people and loyal dogs and second chances worth fighting for. "He's doing great," Daniel said honestly. "But I think he's been waiting for this visit. He asks about you every time we drive past the school." Emma giggled, a sound that was bright and clear and absolutely worth every moment of chaos and paperwork and difficult testimony that had filled the weeks between that first morning and this one. She buried her face in Thor's fur again, and Daniel saw his partner's eyes close in contentment as the dog leaned into her embrace with total trust and acceptance. "I wanted to thank you again," Emma said softly, pulling back just enough to look at both Daniel's and Thor. "For seeing me, for believing me, for staying." Daniels crouched down to her level and met her eyes with the same respect he'd shown from the very beginning. "You saved yourself, Emma," he said gently. "You were brave enough to carry that backpack every single day until someone finally noticed. Thor just made sure we couldn't ignore what you were trying to show us. You two made it happen together." Emma smiled and pressed her forehead against Thor's muzzle, and Daniels watched his partner's tail sweep the ground in slow, contented arcs. The morning sun broke through the clouds overhead, warming the schoolyard and casting long shadows across the fence where a frightened child had once stood waiting for someone, anyone, to finally see what she'd been hiding. Thor had seen it, had sensed the fear and pain and desperation with instincts that went deeper than training or commands, had refused to look away, refused to move on, refused to let protocol and routine blind his handler to what mattered most. A child who needed protection, a voice that needed to be heard, a life that needed saving. And in the end, that was what being a canine partner meant. Not the arrests or the searches or the impressive statistics. But this, standing guard over innocence, refusing to abandon the vulnerable, being the steady presence that held the line between darkness and safety until help could arrive. Thor had done exactly that, and as Daniels watched his partner lean into Emma's embrace with gentle certainty, he felt a pride and gratitude that went beyond words. They'd saved a life together. They'd given a child her voice back. And no amount of commendations or recognition would ever mean as much as this quiet morning moment. A little girl and a canine who'd chosen to protect her, reunited. In a schoolyard where hope had been restored, one loyal heart at a time.